Thank you to our sponsor for today's episode, East Brother Beer. Located on Canal Boulevard in Point Richmond, East Brother Beer mixes classic brewing styles with precision and modern sensibility to create the perfect Bay Area craft beer. Before we get started, just a reminder that you can find all of my available rental properties on my website at markguzman.com. If you own investment property, click on the Owner Services section to see our complete list of services. It's been 55 years since America was introduced to the Beatles, changing music forever. The musical writings of John Lennon and Paul McCartney had multiple generations of Americans hooked on the British invasion. In the years since the Beatles, their music has lived on through hundreds of different tribute bands and shows. One of those shows is led by Joe Anastasi. His show, Stroll Down Penny Lane, focuses on the songwriting brilliance of Paul McCartney with a masterful blend of music, films, and visuals. Joe shares with us his passion and how he makes this a unique show you won't want to miss. Joe, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so really excited here because my father is a huge Beatles fan, and I grew up every weekend he'd put on the Beatles from Friday night to Sunday.
Oh, really?
On repeat. We listened to a lot of Beatles, my sister and I. So he's a huge Beatle fan, and I think he's going to love this episode. And we were just briefly talking about some of the unique things about your show, and so we'll jump right into it. Now, one of the things I like to ask every guest that comes onto the show is, what has your attention right now? Which could be the show, it could be something else, book, music. What has your attention?
Well, mostly we have 25 or so films in the show, and so I've created a couple of new films. Every time we do the show, I try to update it with some new material. So we're adding films for the performance of You Never Give Me Your Money from the Second Side of Abbey Road. We're updating the show to include Fool on the Hill, and also to have a film with respect to the song Get Back. So those films are being produced even as we're talking. There's an editor that's working on it based upon the screenplay that I wrote, and so we have motion graphics specialist out of Kentucky working on that. The film editor is working on that. Our sound guy is working on helping them with that too. So that is being we've already got 25 done, but these are the 2 or 3 new ones. They're being done this week. And we're in rehearsals again this week for our shows coming up at the end of September 28th, and the next show after that in Pittsburgh, which is October 5th.
Very cool. Now, how long have you been doing this?
Well, we didn't. I'm not sure how much time we have today, but you tell me if I'm going off on too far here. But it started off with, I thought about doing this kind of storytelling about the music of Paul McCartney by doing podcasts a long time ago. And then I thought, well, no, maybe it's better to do this with a live show. And so...
Were you one of the original people doing podcasts back in the early 2000s?
No. I actually kind of abandoned that for this notion of doing this live show. So then I started doing the arrangements for the recordings, and then started doing these films. And so the films have been for the last 5 years. The arrangements have been for more than 5 years. And the performances, as we unveiled the shows, began in 2018. And so they've been really well received by audiences since then. But it's been a long time in gestation, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what's your history? What's your background? What eventually led you to start the show?
Okay, so there's a good old James Thurber short story about the secret life of Walter Mitty. Okay, so here's this guy who has this world, and then he's in the secret life. Okay, so I have a secret life too. So the secret life aspect is this notion of the music of Paul McCartney, and the music in general. So in terms of my other world experience, in terms of research and presenting complex information, I'm taking that as a background to figure out how to analyze, research, and present some complex information about what is it about the music of the Beatles or the music of Paul McCartney. Why does it move us so? Why is it good? Right. Mm-hmm. So and there's ways to actually figure that out and present it. And so I'm about the notion of storytelling and the presentation of this music and why it's good and telling that story.
In your opinion, why is it good? Because there are college courses at big universities that analyze the Beatles and the lyrics and many things that even Paul McCartney wrote himself.
Right. Yeah. And that's true because they as kids, so here's, if you're a kid and the brain of a human is very plastic when you're young. If you're learning this stuff when you're young, and then you get immersed in it, I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote, well, the Beatles are an example of how you become masters at a subject. His point was they spent 10,000 hours, in Hamburg and performing, and 10,000 hours. When you spend that much time as kids, you become world class. And so they spent that much time being world class. They studied and they learned all these pop and standards. And, Paul's father would play in a jazz band, and he would play the piano at home. And Paul would be laying on the ground underneath the piano, and his father would play this chord and say, hey, try to do that chord on the guitar. So, you get this interchange between your father and I think Lennon learned how to play, his mother taught him from the banjo. And, when Lennon was playing for McCartney when they were still kids, he was just playing banjo chords. So Paul helped him figure out real guitar chords. So, and then they studied the standards, and then they had an audience where they're having to perform for 10 hours a day in these dive bars in Hamburg, for a demanding audience that's pounding down beers and saying, mock show, make a good show. And they had to really dig deep. And when they dug deep, they were digging into these standards and they learned them. And then the other part that's interesting is when they were performing, they would be able to get input from an audience. And so when they did this first time they did a song, and instead of putting in an A chord, they put in an A minor chord, and the audience, the girls, start screaming, and they hear this and they say, oh, that one worked. I'm going to keep doing that in other songs. So they would get that kind of feedback going from the audience, and that's how they learned, and they became masters.
It's amazing, like when you see performers, when they really fine-tune their music, fine-tune their performance based on the feedback from the audience, you really see them excel at other levels. You have some performers that simply want to play just what they want to play, and that's it.
Right.
But then you have, and I guess that differentiates the people that end up being world class, where they really fine tune and feed off the audience and see what works, what doesn't work, kind of like anything else in business and marketing.
Right. And even today, Paul McCartney's doing concerts today, right? And he's in front of 10,000 or 15,000 people. And he'll say that when he's in that stadium, when they do a song that resonates with the audience, could be a Beatles song, then it's like this live world that's out there interacting with them. There's all these flashes and lights going off with the phones, or they have the phones out. And then he says this, and then I'll perform a new song that I wrote this year, and then it's like looking out into a cave, a black hole. There's there's none of that reaction, and so he knows that, right? And so any performer gets that feedback too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, my understanding is that they didn't succeed well in the UK, and they really blew up when they came to the US. Is that correct?
Yes and no. They were huge hits in the UK, 62, 63. But they weren't hits before that. They had to go to Germany, Hamburg, to get in some experience. But Beatlemania is the term. It was coined in the press in England from watching these kids scrambling in the airport on the tarmacs, running over the conveyor belts to get through the security, to get through the conveyor belt, through the little opening in the wall, so they could get out to the tarmac to see the plane in England. And then I'll just tell you this story. It's part of one of the stories we tell in the show. Is Capitol Records turned them down.
Really?
Yes. So the song "She Loves You," huge hit, huge song. No, Capitol Records wouldn't do it.
Wow.
Really, and a couple of the other songs before that. And finally, and here we tell the story in the show, is finally Ed Sullivan was on an airplane on a tarmac at the Heathrow Airport, and he sees this mass pandemonium as this plane lands, and the Beatles were arriving from maybe Sweden or something, and all their fans were rushing, the airport. He says, "What is this?" And he didn't know, but he said, "Okay, well, we should book them," and they did, and then there was a film documentary that was to be released about the Beatles and the Beatlemania. And it was to be released November 2nd, I think, 1963. Check that date. But it turned out that was the date of the assassination of President Kennedy. So the story got shelved, okay? And then a couple of weeks later, Walter Cronkite thought, well, maybe the U.S. is ready for an upbeat story, and they released the story about the Beatles. And so and then somebody brought a bootleg record of "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and a radio station in Washington, D.C. played it, and the phones lit up, and so with the reaction to that song. You couldn't get that song in the United States, but the reaction from the audience of listening to it was like huge, and that woke up Capitol Records, and they said, all right, well, we better release this. And so they did, and they scrambled to stop all the presses from printing other songs and records. So to get it out for the Christmas the holiday season in 1963, and so that's how the Beatles became so popular to begin with. And then the Ed Sullivan Show was, about 30 days later. So there was this crescendo. And some people say the other reason why they were so big immediately it was the holiday break. Okay, so the kids are out, they're not in school, they have time to listen to the radios, they have time to listen to the records. So, and that 10 or 15-day break of the holidays at the end of the year.
And that's when it hit.
And then it just took off from there. And then the Ed Sullivan Show was within, 30 days of that.
It's amazing how a lot of things also come down to timing, isn't it?
Right.
Just perfect timing,
Right.
Perfect place, where all these different things just coming together that just end up building
Right.
your band to like extreme unknown levels at the time.
Well, in the United States, they just went right to the top. I mean, when the Ed Sullivan Show first aired, so imagine this on a Sunday, 73 million Americans watched that show on one evening, okay, because of the Beatles, their first appearance.
Wow, that's amazing. Right now, I think the average TV show gets about 40,000 viewers.
Right, exactly.
So
think about
73
that.
million.
Have them sit down at that.
Super Bowl against 73 million nowadays.
Yeah,
Right.
that's amazing. Have you ever met Paul McCartney? Or
No.
So, are you focused just on his music, or is it the Beatles overall?
I made a decision to focus on his music to be able to tell the stories and to focus on that. So, but the thing is, to do that, we touch on the stuff that they did before the Beatles, like Little Richard. Okay, so tell your dad we're doing Little Richard material, like Long Tall Sally, and then Paul did a lot of the songs for the Beatles, right? And part of the great success of those songs, though, were the contributions of the others. Okay, Ringo's drumming was unique, right? Then the harmonies. So if you heard our recording session and you heard, okay, this song sounds nice because the vocals are good, this is good, but then you hear the harmonies get layered in as we record those and get the arrangements down, it's just transformational. So the harmonies, there was 3 people singing. 3-part harmonies, and I think on the song Michel, they were double tracking this and that. There might have been 6-part harmonies for that song. So that's really remarkable, and so that's not just Paul; it's all of them, the Beatles. But then, of course, they wrote 200 songs in the Beatles, but he's written another 300 on his own, right?
Yeah, he's released a lot of albums. It seems like in the last 10 years.
Oh yeah, well, since the breakup of the Beatles in the 70s, he did the Band on the Run album. I mean, huge hits, and so that's continued throughout. And so we're getting different material from his career, mostly, the early years of the Beatles, and then the early years when he was with Wings and on his own for some of those songs.
So when someone goes to your show, Stroll Down Penny Lane, what is your goal for the audience? I mean, what are you trying to? What's the message you're trying to convey to them?
Right, it's very specific because I know that I'm not Paul McCartney. We're not the Beatles. Okay, so what is it that's going to capture your attention and you feel that you got something that's equally interesting? And so you'll come away with the storytelling about there'll be 25 films, maybe 26 films that will tell. Maybe it'll tell the story about what was happening at the time a song was being written in 1969. Okay, I just told you the story about I Want to Hold Your Hand. I told you a couple aspects about that. We tell that story about that song. So, and sometimes we'll tell you a little bit about what makes this song so interesting, okay, musically interesting, or interesting because of the history of what was going on at the time. But even, there's some songs that I remember when I was a kid, when I heard in the second side of Abbey Road, I would hear that she came in through the bathroom window. And every time I would hear that as a kid, teenager, I would get this tingle going down my spine. And I never knew why that is. But now I do. And so I know how to replicate that. There's a special thing in terms of the construction of that song that we are all wired for as humans or as animals, really, because we come from nature, and in nature we're tuned to be listening for possible threats, a lion or a tiger. That sounds are important to us and so these things affect our inner core, and some of the musical devices strike that inner core, and some of them are in the Beatles' music. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Is that something that was planned by the Beatles, or it's something that just naturally happened?
Well, they knew the material that had worked for the previous 20 or 30 years. They knew it was working in rock and roll in the 50s. They knew it was working in the 60s. So all of that is, accreted knowledge over time, right? And so these guys were the sponges. They were experts. Plus, they're gifted. They're really gifted in terms of their musical abilities.
I guess that's pretty impressive when your music can change or affect the physical, someone's physical attributes, or just physiological, just change them and modify them during that performance.
Well, think about this. I shouldn't tell you this story, but I'm going to. Okay, when they first were coming out and they would have all the screaming, the girls would be screaming, right? And it wasn't because they were screaming because they just felt like screaming. They were screaming because there was something being triggered in the music that made them just get hysterical. And the part that I shouldn't tell you that I'm going to tell you is that the janitors in those theaters in the 60, 62, 63 time frame, the seats would be wet. Okay? Yeah. That's right. Okay. All right. And there was a reason for that, right? They were so excited. Okay. The music had excited people, and it wasn't one seat that was wet. There were the whole
even the men's seats.
What about the Max's seats?
Yeah, I don't know about that. That's as far as I'm going to go with this story. Okay.
I guess if you can modify or you can make music that affects people like that, I think you're just winning at that point.
Right, and you're hearing it. They were hearing it, and they said, "Okay, that works." And then the song, the two other songs that they weren't screaming for, they said, "Okay, well, we won't do those anymore. We'll do," So they built on that, and then of course they were so successful. Then they rejected that. Right? They said, well, we're not going to perform live anymore because we can't even hear ourselves. And they rejected that pop aspect of the Beatles music, and then created some of these really elaborate masterpieces that were different. And I think they also had this goal to never repeat themselves.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Simply to go back and kind of see the evolution of the Beatles. When they first came out, they were completely dressed up in suits, very proper. Then they kind of went a whole different direction. Some people call it like the hippie stage of the Beatles. For you, what was that transition like? And do you have a favorite between those two types of Beatles?
Well, actually, when they first started out, they were about as grunge looking a group as you can imagine. They were in black leather, pants and jackets and black shirts, and their hair was all slicked up, and they would be smoking on stage. All right. And the cigarettes at the end of the guitar. Here's where your tuning pegs are. The cigarette would be in the strings up there. So, and then they would be eating sandwiches in between songs or on. Okay, and then they got a manager, Brian Epstein, who put them in these very expensive suits, and so then what that did was, so you get these kids now, their hair's combed, it's long, right, but they're in these they're impeccably tailored suits, right, and they're doing rock and roll, right, but they're appearing like they're really polished and they're really presentable. So if you're the parents of a child in 1962 or 63, and some people would not allow their kids to listen to this rock and roll music, right? But here is a group that was presenting the same music, but they looked presentable, right? So there's the devil's bargain that gets. Then Brian died tragically a couple years later, and then of course the 60s and the hippie aspect of the 60s, and the Beatles couldn't ignore that all these other groups that were having success then too, right, were not really the clean-cut looking groups. So that's why they would shed that image and start exploring other parts of their presentation. Interesting. It's kind of rejecting what was successful because they were successful, right?
Yeah. That's very interesting. There's a lot of colleges and universities that study the entire Beatle history, and I guess as you get into their history, why they did certain things, how they made chairs go wet, I can see why universities are really studying their lyrics, their music, and all the various different tactics that they used to really just become a top-level band. I mean, one of the biggest bands in the world.
Yes, right. So the part about the college experience is that in terms of music theory, the Beatles, the constructions of their songs. Okay, there's George would write songs, John would write songs, Paul would write songs, and Ringo to a lesser extent. But the construction of their songs, in some cases, they're simple. Okay, it's very much like the 50s 3-chord rock and roll kind of thing. And then other parts of it are not simple, and it's very elegant, okay? And so, some people would compare McCartney's writing to Gershwin. Whether or not that's fair or not, but McCartney, as an example, he employed a lot of sophisticated songwriting techniques in terms of the construction of the song, and music theorists would then comment on, well, they're using this approach or that approach. Now, when it would be described in a way that an academic would understand it and could describe it, and if John Lennon or Paul heard that, they would scratch their head and say, well, what the hell is he talking about, right? But they had absorbed it. They didn't know what the labels were for this, but they had absorbed it, and they could, more importantly than that, it's not academic, they could apply it. And when they applied it, they could see, well, look how the audience is reacting to that song, okay? And let's do that. And then let's start adjusting it, step by step.
It became second nature for them.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Just automated, yeah.
Right. So, for example, Paul McCartney wrote the song Hey Jude, right? He wrote it driving in a car to go visit John's son, Julian, and he wrote the lyrics. It was about, hey, Julian, don't make it bad. Take a sad song. And he came up with that and the structure of the song while he's driving behind the wheel of a car, right? Now, can you do that? Can I do that? No. He can do that, or he could do that. And
That's
he did
amazing.
It. Yeah.
How have you seen his lyrics progress from when he was with the Beatles to now performing solo?
Well, he had one of the benefits he had when he was with the Beatles. He would have John to bounce things off of, and oftentimes they would get stuck, and then they could bounce things off of each other, or the other partner would come up with something. So you have this collaboration which helps to improve things. That started to change when they weren't writing things together so much, but they were always able to present it to each other, and that other person's feedback or acceptance or rejection. I mean, they wouldn't do a song unless they all agreed it was good. Okay, so you got that filter. All right, so now after the Beatles are gone, you don't have that filter of John Lennon now, who's, you know, he's a pretty strong-willed individual. You don't have somebody who's equally adept or facile to say, no, that's not going to work, right? So that dynamic changed. But still, Paul has written some really fabulous songs. And, you know, some of his best, Maybe I'm Amazed, is one of, you know, he wrote that. He wrote The Band on the Run. Some of the songs from that album are just awesome. And others. And we depict some of these other songs through the course of the show.
Now, through the show, does each song have its own video? Is that how it's set up?
If we do 30 or so songs, I think we have 25 films. And then we have a couple of film fragments and song fragments, so maybe there's 30, 35 songs. So the answer is pretty much as a film for most all the songs, and then some of them are just so powerful that it doesn't need a film, or I haven't really been struck by something to say about the song. Let's just do it. We don't have to have a film that talks about it. Let's just do it because it's so good.
Now, besides putting the whole show together, what's your role within the show?
So I guess I'm technically I'm the executive producer. I am instrumental in arranging the music. So we have to, you know, the Beatles were pretty awesome, and we have to figure out how to present it live. So we have to break down the arrangements so that, you know, 4 or 5 of us can actually present it. So the song arrangement, the recording aspect of it, the writing of the screenplays for the development of the films, and then I play the rhythm guitar, both electric as well as acoustic, and the lead vocalist as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
very cool.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what's it take? I mean, how many people are involved in this show?
Let's see. So there's 5 of us who perform, right? And in terms of the film development side, there's been 3 in cinematography. You know, 3 to 10 other people over time, and then of course you have the other people in terms of management of the. Our manager Billy Cohen, and then the media and public relations aspect of it takes on, you know. So the thing is, my goal was, let's get this show that's really great. Okay, we have this show that's really great. It's awesome. Then you need to figure out the ability to bring it to a theater, and then reach out and get an audience to be aware of it to come, right? So that all of that is part of this process too.
So what would you say is the biggest challenge in putting together these shows? Would it be the marketing?
Now it is the biggest challenge. I think so. Yeah. We're learning that process as we go as well. So, and you know, there's this world. So, you know, Corinne Kahn helps us with the media and public relations, and then we have Antonio Guedes, who's helping us with the social media. I mean, this thing that didn't exist 15 years ago. You know, the aspect of doing social media, which is most everybody thinks of that as interacting with your friends and things, but there's, you know, it's about social media. Also, is about getting out content, which is what this podcast is getting content out to the world, or to a small subset of the world.
Yeah, and social media, it's amazing what you can do with even targeted ads, because you can literally serve ads for the show to people who follow Beatle fan pages.
So that's kind of the epiphany for me, is to learn that type of a thing, because I didn't really understand that to be the case. And most people, I don't really think about when they're on Facebook that, maybe they're getting targeted for ads and stuff. That's kind of like the secret, right?
Yeah.
But it's part of that world, big time.
So when's the next show? I believe you said toward the end of September?
September 28th, we're in Modesto at the State Theater in Modesto. And then the week and after that, which is October 5th on a Saturday, we're in Pittsburgh in downtown Pittsburgh.
Perfect. Downtown Pittsburgh, they've done a lot of changes there. They've put a lot of money into remodeling that city.
Yeah, and the theater is in downtown Pittsburgh is really quite remarkable. So that's one of the nice things that I'm experiencing is we're going into these communities, whether it's Vallejo or Fairfield or Pittsburgh or and I get to experience these communities that otherwise you're driving by them in the course of your lifetime.
Yeah.
Right.
So the website is strolldownpennylane.com, and excited to see this. I'm gonna get tickets probably to the Pittsburgh show. And the Pittsburgh show, you said again, it's October 5th?
5th, a Saturday, 7:00 p.m.
Okay, perfect. Right. I'm gonna tell my dad about that one.
Yeah,
we'll
and you can see those dates and the links to get to tickets and links to the shows are also could be found on strolldownpennylane.com.
Okay.
And there's a 3-minute film on that website that shows the, excerpts of the performance together with excerpts of some of the films, so you can get a sense of, okay, this is what he's talking about. This is how the show is being presented. You get a sense of the sound, the presentation on stage, and the films that are telling the stories as the show is progressing.
Okay, very cool. So I'm really excited for this show. Joe, thank you for coming on to the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, very excited for that. And again, thank you. Want to thank East Brother Beer for being the show sponsor. They've been a sponsor of ours for now how long? Year and a half?
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years, yeah. So again, thank you. I'm excited for this. Again, for the listeners, it's strolldownpennylane.com. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubman. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at markguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.